Welcome back. Today we are talking about a true miracle. The simple miracle that we are all still here to tell these stories. If you grew up in the 1950s or 60s, you know exactly what I mean. Today's world is completely wrapped in bubble wrap. Everything has a bright warning label, a complicated safety latch, or a heavily padded corner. But back when we were kids, safety wasn't just a secondary concern. It sometimes felt like it didn't exist at all. And yet, looking back, those were undeniably the best days of our lives. We didn't have protective gear, we didn't have constantly hovering parents, and we certainly didn't have child-proof caps on every single bottle in the house. What we had was common sense, a few fresh scrapes on our knees, and a whole lot of freedom. Let's take a look back at some of the incredibly dangerous, completely normal things we all did every single day. Things that were just a normal part of growing up, but would probably get people arrested today. Let's start with the family car. Today, installing a child's car seat requires a manual the size of a phone book and sometimes a professional inspection. A modern vehicle is a high-tech fortress of airbags, sensors, and crumple zones. But do you remember what it was actually like riding in the massive family station wagon back in the day? Seatbelts? If the car even had them installed, they were shoved deep down into the cracks of the sticky vinyl seats, completely ignored by everyone. We didn't strap in, we roamed free. The dashboard was made of solid, unforgiving painted steel, heavily adorned with sharp protruding metal knobs for the radio and the headlights. In the dead of summer, that thick vinyl seating would get so incredibly hot, it would practically brand the backs of your bare legs when you jumped in wearing shorts. And where did the kids sit during a long road trip? Everywhere, except properly seated, looking forward. If you were lucky, you got to claim the way back of the station wagon, happily rolling around with the loose luggage and the groceries as the car took sharp turns. Even better was the wide ledge right beneath the rear window. It was the absolute prime sleeping spot on a long night drive. You would stretch out right there, inches from the glass, completely unrestrained, while your parents smoked in the front seat with the windows rolled up. If Dad had to hit the brakes suddenly, Mom's right arm would instinctively shoot out across the passenger seat. That single, heroic mom arm was our only airbag. It was supposed to magically stop the forward momentum of a flying child. And what about riding in the back of a pickup truck? On a hot summer afternoon, absolutely nothing beat the feeling of sitting on the metal wheel wells in the open bed of a truck, the wind whipping through your hair, holding onto the sides for dear life as the truck bounced heavily down a dirt road. Today, doing that would result in a massive fine and a news story. Back then, it was simply how you got a ride to the local hardware store. And when we weren't dodging hazards in the car, we were heading straight to the local playground. Modern playgrounds are lovely, quiet places. They have soft, bouncy rubber surfaces, rounded plastic edges, and strict height limits for safety. But the playgrounds we grew up with were basically military obstacle courses built directly on solid concrete. Who could forget the towering metal slides? In the middle of July, sitting directly in the blazing sun, that tall, galvanized steel slide would heat up to the temperature of a frying pan. You had to have a strategic approach to get down without suffering second-degree burns on your legs. We would grab a piece of wax paper from Mom's kitchen, sit on it, and launch ourselves down that scorching metal chute. The wax made you go twice as fast, shooting you off the end and directly onto the hard, unforgiving asphalt. Then there was the merry-go-round. Not the gentle, slow-moving plastic ones they have now. This was a heavy, unstoppable wheel of solid iron and splintering wood. The older kids would grab the thick metal bars and run as fast as humanly possible, spinning the entire contraption into a dizzying blur before jumping on. You just had to hold on tightly as the massive centrifugal force tried to physically throw you off into the gravel. If you lost your grip, you were flying. And the seesaws? Heavy wooden planks resting on a pinching metal fulcrum. If the kid on the bottom decided to jump off without warning, the kid at the top would come crashing down to the ground with a spine-rattling thud. We lost teeth, we broke arms, we scraped our knees raw, and we went back the very next day for more. Merculate was applied liberally by our mothers, stinging like absolute fire, and then you were sent right back outside to play. Which brings us to another beautiful, vanished memory. When you were playing outside in the intense summer heat, running around until you were completely exhausted, you didn't run inside the house to grab a single-use plastic bottle of purified spring water. You didn't even go inside to ask for a glass. You went straight for the garden hose. You'd turn the rusty metal spigot, let the boiling hot water run out for a few seconds until it finally turned cold, and then you drank directly from the brass nozzle. The water tasted strongly of green rubber, minerals, and whatever dirt was lingering on the end of the hose, but I promise you, it was the most refreshing drink in the entire world. We shared that exact same hose with every kid in the neighborhood, and usually the family dog, too. Nobody worried about bacteria or sanitation. We drank from the hose, we stayed outside until the streetlights came on, and we survived. Our parents had absolutely no idea where we were for 8 hours a day. There were no cell phones to track our locations. The only rule was simply be home when dinner's ready. Speaking of being outside, let's talk about our primary mode of transportation, the bicycle. Today, if a child rides a bike to the end of the driveway without a shock-absorbing, aerodynamically tested helmet, knee pads, and elbow pads, neighbors might actually call the authorities. But in the 1950s and 60s, bicycle helmets simply did not exist. Not only did we not have helmets, but we rode our bikes in the most dangerous ways imaginable. We had those heavy Schwinn bicycles with the high-rise ape-hanger handlebars and the long, slippery vinyl banana seats. You could easily fit 2, sometimes 3 kids on one bike, one pedaling, one sitting comfortably on the banana seat, and another bravely balancing on the front handlebars, completely obstructing the driver's view. We rode them fast, we rode them down steep hills with questionable brakes, and most shockingly by today's standards, we often rode them completely barefoot. If your foot slipped off that jagged metal pedal, it would slice your shin wide open, and if you hit a rogue pebble while riding one of those early skateboards with the solid clay wheels, the board stopped dead, and you became airborne. We didn't wear protective gear. Our protective gear was learning how to fall correctly and not cry too loudly when we hit the pavement. When we weren't riding bikes, we were playing in the backyard with toys that would absolutely terrify modern safety inspectors. Does anyone remember lawn darts, also known as jarts? These weren't the lightweight, rounded plastic things they sell today. These were massive, heavy metal spikes, essentially heavy artillery designed for the backyard. The objective was to casually toss these weighted metal javelins high into the air and try to land them inside a plastic ring on the lawn. Meanwhile, other children, the family dog and barefoot adults, were wandering aimlessly around the exact same yard. It was a game of pure survival. And then there were clackers. 2 heavy, solid acrylic balls attached by a sturdy string. The entire goal of the toy was to violently swing them up and down so they would smash into each other as fast and as hard as possible. Not only would they leave massive black and blue bruises all up and down your forearms, but occasionally, the plastic would simply give up from the impact and shatter, sending sharp acrylic shrapnel flying in every direction. Did our parents confiscate them? Only if the noise was bothering them while they watched television. Even indoor toys were an absolute liability. If you had an interest in science, you might have received a children's chemistry set for Christmas. But these weren't the harmless baking soda and vinegar kits of today. These vintage metal boxes contained actual dangerous chemicals, real glass test tubes, and a functioning alcohol lamp with a live, open flame. We were unsupervised 8-year-olds in our bedrooms, melting glass, mixing toxic powders, and occasionally causing minor explosions that left scorch marks on our bedroom desks. And speaking of toxic things inside the house, what happened when you actually did get sick? Your mother would pull out the glass mercury thermometer. It was incredibly fragile, and inevitably, someone would drop it on the bathroom tile. Today, if a mercury thermometer breaks, people treat it like a hazardous materials emergency. Back then, it was entertainment. Our mothers would sweep up the broken glass but let us play with the little beads of liquid mercury on the floor. We would push the fascinating silver droplets together with our bare fingers, watching them absorb into one large puddle. We had no idea it was highly toxic. It was just science magic on the bathroom floor. And we can't talk about the 1950s and 60s, without mentioning the completely different attitude toward the sun. Today, going to the beach involves slathering on a thick layer of SPF 50 sunscreen every 2 hours, sitting under an umbrella, and wearing UV protective clothing. Back then, the concept of sunblock was virtually unknown. The goal wasn't to protect your skin. The goal was to get as dark as humanly possible, as fast as possible. Teenagers and young mothers would literally mix baby oil with drops of dark iodine, smear it all over their bodies, and lay out in the blazing midday sun on top of a reflective aluminum foil blanket. We baked ourselves like potatoes. By the evening, we were lobster red and radiating heat. When the inevitable severe sunburn set in, your mother might rub some Noxima or straight aloe from a plant on your back, but you just had to suffer through the peeling. Finally, there was the smoke. It is almost impossible to explain to younger generations just how pervasive smoking was. Adults smoked everywhere, all the time. There were heavy glass ashtrays in the grocery store aisles, in the doctor's waiting rooms, and even bolted to the armrests of airplanes. If you went to visit a relative in the hospital, the room was probably filled with a cloud of cigarette smoke. But the craziest part was our involvement as kids. It was completely normal for a parent to hand a 7-year-old child a handwritten note and a dollar bill and send them walking down to the corner store to buy a pack of cigarettes. The clerk wouldn't even blink. They would read the note from your father, hand you the unfiltered cigarettes, give you the change, and send you on your way. And to make us feel included, the candy companies made candy cigarettes, little white chalky sugar sticks with a tip dyed red to look like a burning cherry. We would stand on the corner, pretending to smoke just like our parents, blowing out puffs of cold winter air and feeling incredibly grown up. It was a completely different world, running on a completely different set of rules. Now let's move on to the holidays, which were somehow even more perilous than our everyday lives. Take Halloween, for example. Today, Halloween costumes are flame retardant, brightly colored, equipped with reflective tape, and children are carefully escorted from house to house well before it gets completely dark. But in the 1950s and 60s, Halloween was a completely unsupervised test of survival. We went to the local 5 and dime store and bought our costumes in a cardboard box with a cellophane window. The costume consisted of 2 parts, a plastic smock that was highly flammable and a rigid plastic face mask held on by a single, thin, incredibly tight elastic string. That string would inevitably snap and whip you in the ear, but the mask itself was the real hazard. The eye holes were jagged and tiny, completely destroying your peripheral vision. After 5 minutes of walking, the inside of the mask would become completely coated in condensation from your own breath, making it impossible to see the cracked, uneven sidewalks. You would stumble blindly through the pitch-black neighborhood, carrying a heavy pillowcase full of candy, while people proudly displayed their jack-o'-lanterns on wooden porches, illuminated by completely exposed live candle flames. When Christmas rolled around, the danger simply moved indoors. Today we have artificial trees and cool-to-the-touch LED lights. Back then, a Christmas tree was a serious fire hazard that we brought directly into our living rooms and actively encouraged to dry out. Our fathers would string up those massive, colorful C9 incandescent glass bulbs. Those bulbs got so incredibly hot that they would actually scorch the pine needles they were touching. If you had the fancy bubbling lights, you were staring at a glass tube filled with a low boiling toxic chemical right at eye level, and the decorations were just as wild. We covered our trees in heavy, shiny strips of pure lead tinsel. We would carefully drape these toxic metal strips over the branches, and nobody gave it a second thought when the family cat inevitably chewed on them. To make the tree look beautifully frosted, we would spray fake snow out of an aerosol can, and in many households, that powdery fake snow was made using pure asbestos. It truly is a holiday miracle that we made it to the new year with our homes intact. And it wasn't just the holiday decorations that were questionable. Our entire homes were built with materials that would cause a modern hazmat team to immediately evacuate the neighborhood. Asbestos was considered a modern miracle material. It was woven into the thick oven mitts our mothers used to pull hot casseroles out of the stove. Our basement pipes were wrapped in it, and our textured acoustic ceilings were full of it, and the paint on our walls loaded with lead. It is a running joke today, But back then, cribs and wooden toys were completely covered in heavy lead paint. If a baby chewed on the railing of their wooden crib, leaving little teeth marks all over the wood, nobody panicked or called a pediatrician. The parents simply went to the hardware store and bought another can of lead paint to touch it up. Let's step into the 1950s kitchen. It was the heart of the home, but also a place of highly questionable food safety practices by today's strict standards. Expiration dates on milk and meat? Those were largely a suggestion, if they even existed at all. The true, ultimate test of whether something was safe to consume was a mother's sniff test. If it didn't smell terribly rancid, it went right into the cooking pot. And sitting proudly on the back of almost every stove was a heavy metal tin or a ceramic jar filled to the absolute brim with leftover bacon grease. We never threw grease away. It sat out at room temperature for weeks, sometimes months. Whenever someone was frying eggs, cooking potatoes, or making gravy, they just scooped a spoonful of warm fat out of the can. Nobody worried about cholesterol, and nobody worried about bacteria growing in a warm can of fat sitting on a hot stove. The kitchen was also home to the most terrifying piece of cookware ever invented, the early pressure cooker. These heavy aluminum pots were essentially domestic bombs. Your mother would lock the heavy lid into place, put the little metal jiggler weight on the vent pipe, and turn the heat on high. You would sit in the living room listening to it aggressively hiss and rattle, terrified that today was the day it would finally explode. And occasionally, they did. Every neighborhood had at least one story of a mother who opened the lid a second too soon, resulting in a deafening explosion that permanently painted the kitchen ceiling with boiling hot beef stew and carrots. But perhaps the most shocking thing of all to modern parents was the complete and total lack of constant adult supervision. Today, the idea of leaving a 7-year-old home alone is deeply frowned upon. But back then, mothers had heavy chores to do, errands to run, and multiple younger siblings to tend to. When you got home from school, you often unlocked the front door yourself. You made a highly questionable afternoon snack consisting of white bread and refined sugar. And you watched television until your parents got home. If you got into a physical fight with your siblings, you worked it out yourselves without a mediator. If you fell and scraped your arm, you found the Band-Aids and dealt with it. We learned independence not out of neglect, but out of absolute necessity. We were tiny, self-sufficient adults managing our own daily lives, making our own mistakes, and learning exactly how the real world worked without a safety net constantly waiting to catch us underneath. Let's step out of the kitchen and take a trip down to the local shoe store, because nothing perfectly illustrates the sheer madness of mid-century safety standards, quite like the shoe-fitting fluoroscope. Today, if a child needs a medical X-ray, they are draped in heavy lead aprons, the technician hides behind a reinforced wall, and the exposure is limited to a fraction of a second. But in the 1950s, radiation was treated like a fun, modern novelty. When our mothers took us to buy new school shoes, the salesman wouldn't just press his thumb against the toe of the leather shoe to check the fit. Instead, he would direct us to a large, imposing wooden cabinet sitting right in the middle of the sales floor. You would step up onto the platform, slide your newly shod feet into a dark slot at the bottom, and look down through a viewing porthole. Your mother and the salesman had their own portholes to look through. When the machine was turned on, it bombarded your feet with a massive unshielded dose of raw radiation. You could look down and actually see the glowing green bones of your own toes wiggling inside the outline of the shoe. We thought it was absolute magic. We would beg to stay in the machine longer, happily soaking up radiation for 5 straight minutes just for entertainment, while the salesman assured our mothers it was a perfectly healthy marvel of modern science. Speaking of health, the way we handled medicine and minor ailments back then would make a modern pediatrician faint. Today, all medications are sealed behind complex, child-proof, push-and-turn plastic caps. But back then, medicine bottles simply had a regular screw top or a cork. And to make matters worse, the medicine was actively designed to appeal to children. Who could forget the classic St. Joseph's Children's aspirin? They were tiny, bright orange pills that tasted exactly like delicious sweet orange candy. They were kept in a glass bottle on a low bathroom shelf, completely accessible to any toddler with a sweet tooth. And if a baby was crying from teething pain, there was no sophisticated teething gel. A grandmother or mother would simply dip her finger directly into a glass of whiskey or bourbon and generously rub the hard liquor all over the infant's gums to numb the pain and help them sleep. If a child had a severe cough or a stomach ache, out came the heavy glass bottle of paregoric. This was a completely legal, over-the-counter medicine that was essentially a mixture of alcohol and powdered opium. A spoonful of that would knock a child out cold for 12 hours straight. We were heavily medicated with things that are strictly controlled substances today, and a trip to the doctor's office wasn't exactly a lesson in modern health either. When you went to see the family physician for your annual checkup, you would sit on the crinkly white paper of the examination table, and the doctor would walk in wearing a pristine white coat, holding a stethoscope, and actively smoking a cigarette. He would listen to your lungs and tell you to take a deep breath while a cloud of gray smoke billowed around the tiny examination room. The doctor's heavy glass ashtray was always sitting right next to the tongue depressors and the cotton balls. In fact, if your mother complained about stress or anxiety, that same doctor might actually prescribe her a specific brand of filtered cigarettes to help calm her nerves. Smoking was considered a completely normal, sophisticated habit, even endorsed by medical professionals in magazines and television commercials. When we weren't being subjected to questionable medical practices, we were surviving the grueling, unforgiving environment of the mid-century public school system. Today, schools are heavily focused on positive reinforcement, emotional well-being, and safe spaces. In the 1960s, the classroom was an absolute dictatorship ruled by the teacher, and the ultimate symbol of that authority was the thick wooden paddle hanging prominently on the wall right behind the teacher's desk. Corporal punishment wasn't just allowed, it was the standard operating procedure. If you talked out of turn, passed a note, or chewed gum, you were called to the front of the class to bend over. The teacher would deliver a swift, stinging smack with that wooden board in front of everyone. There were no lawsuits, and parents didn't storm into the principal's office demanding an apology. In fact, the unwritten rule of the era was terrifyingly simple. If you got a paddling at school and your parents found out about it, you were guaranteed to get a second, much worse punishment the second you walked through the front door. The teacher was always right, and your behavior was entirely your own responsibility. And if you managed to survive the classroom, you still had to survive gym class. There was no inclusive, gentle physical education. Gym class was a brutal, Darwinian arena, and the main event was always dodgeball. The gym teacher would dump a massive canvas bag full of those iconic heavy red rubber balls into the center of the hardwood floor. You know exactly the ones I'm talking about. They had a distinct, slightly metallic rubber smell, a textured crosshatch pattern, and they were inflated until they were rock hard. When one of those red spheres hit you square in the face or the bare leg, it sounded like a cannon going off, completely echoing through the gymnasium. It would leave a perfect stinging red circle embedded on your skin for hours. There was no crying aloud. You just rubbed your leg, picked up the ball, and tried to throw it back twice as hard. It was a completely different era of childhood, where toughness was mandatory, and every single day felt like an adventure in basic survival. Now let's take a look at the neighborhood itself, and the absolute freedom we had when we stepped outside our front doors. During the peak of the summer heat, there was one event that brought every kid in the neighborhood running to the street. You could hear the low rumble of the engine from blocks away, followed by the distinctive loud hissing sound. It was the municipal mosquito fogger truck. Today, if a large truck drove down a residential street pumping out massive thick clouds of heavy chemical pesticides, the entire town would immediately evacuate. Men in hazmat suits would tape off the area. But in the 1950s and 60s, the DDT truck was treated like a highly anticipated mobile amusement park ride. The truck would slowly roll down the asphalt, blowing a dense, incredibly thick, sweet-smelling white fog of pure chemicals into the warm evening air. What did we do? We didn't run inside and shut the windows. We dropped our bikes and physically chased the truck. We ran directly into the toxic cloud, playing hide-and-seek in the blinding white fog, breathing in heavy lungfuls of DDT while our parents sat on the front porch and calmly watched. It was considered a routine public service, and we thought it was the greatest summer entertainment available. Speaking of getting around the neighborhood, the way teenagers traveled back then was completely based on absolute trust in strangers. If a 16-year-old wanted to go to the local swimming hole, the movies, or just a few towns over, and they didn't have a car, they used the most common transportation method of the era: hitchhiking. You simply walked down to the main road, stuck your thumb out, and waited. Today, the thought of a teenager getting into an unlocked car with a complete stranger is the ultimate parental nightmare. But back then, it was just how you got around. Good, decent people picked up hitchhikers all the time. You would hop into the passenger seat of a passing Ford or Chevy, chat with the driver about the weather or baseball, and they would drop you off at your destination. There was no fear, no panic, and certainly no mobile phones to track your location. We operated on a baseline assumption that the world was generally a safe place, filled with neighbors who were willing to help you out. But while the streets felt safe from strangers, our own backyards were filled with daily hazards. Let's talk about the weekend chores. Before the era of strict municipal waste collection and recycling bins, almost every family had a burn barrel sitting right in the backyard. Usually, it was a rusted-out 50-gallon metal oil drum. On Saturday mornings, it was the kids' job to take all the household trash, cardboard boxes, paper, packaging, and whatever else was lying around, and carry it out to the barrel. We would strike a match, throw it in, and watch the flames roar into the sky. We were essentially operating unregulated open-air incinerators right next to the wooden fences and dry grass. And heaven forbid, someone accidentally threw an empty aerosol can of hairspray or shaving cream into the barrel. You would be standing there poking the fire with a long stick, and suddenly, the can would detonate like a small bomb, sending a massive shockwave of heat and flying debris into the air. We would just laugh, brush the ashes off our clothes, and keep burning the trash. If you weren't burning trash in the backyard, you were probably helping your mother with the laundry, which was a genuinely dangerous industrial operation. Before fully automated washers and dryers became the standard, many homes relied on the terrifying Wringer washing machine. This was a heavy, violently vibrating metal beast filled with boiling hot, soapy water. But the real danger was the Wringer itself. Two solid, heavy rubber rollers mounted on the top, spinning tightly together to squeeze the water out of the clothes. You had to manually feed heavy, soaking wet denim jeans and bed sheets into those spinning rollers. There were no automatic safety sensors or emergency stop buttons. If you lost your focus for even a second, the Wringer would grab your fingers, then your hand, and it would keep relentlessly pulling. Every mother in the 1950s knew the absolute panic of having to rapidly throw the machine into reverse because a child had caught their arm in the Wringer. It required total concentration and respect, teaching us very early on that heavy machinery was incredibly unforgiving. And finally, we have to talk about the dogs. The way we treated family pets back then was as wild as the way we treated ourselves. Today, dogs have microchips, GPS collars, organic grain-free diets, and they sleep on orthopedic foam beds inside the air-conditioned house. In the 1950s, a dog was strictly an outdoor animal with a job. First thing in the morning, you opened the back door and let the dog out. There were no fenced-in dog parks or strict leash laws. The neighborhood dogs formed their own loose packs, roaming the streets, chasing passing cars and knocking over metal garbage cans. They belonged to the whole street as much as they belonged to any one family. And what did we feed them? We didn't have specialized, scientifically formulated kibble. After Sunday dinner, we simply scraped all the leftover cooked chicken bones, fat and salty gravy straight into a metal bowl on the back porch. Vets today will tell you that cooked chicken bones are incredibly dangerous for a dog, but our dogs chewed them up happily and lived to be 15 years old. They drank from the same muddy puddles we played in. They slept under the wooden porch in the dirt. And when the sun went down, they somehow always knew exactly which front door to scratch on to come home. Let's move back inside the house and take a close look at how our fathers handled home maintenance and early electricity, because it was basically the Wild West of do-it-yourself repair. Today, every single electrical outlet in a modern home is safely grounded, equipped with a trip switch, and strictly regulated by municipal building codes. But in the mid-century home, electricity was still treated with a very casual, almost dismissive attitude. Many older houses only had two-prong outlets, and the actual wiring hidden inside the walls was insulated with cloth that would easily fray, dry rot, and expose live copper. When a fuse blew because your mother plugged in the heavy electric iron at the exact same time the bulky refrigerator compressor kicked on, the entire house would immediately plunge into darkness. Nobody panicked or called a licensed expensive electrician. Instead, your father would grab a heavy metal flashlight, walk down the creaky wooden stairs to the dark, damp basement, open the metal fuse box, and employ the most dangerous, universally accepted life hack of the entire era. He would simply slide a solid copper penny right behind the blown glass fuse and screw it firmly back into the socket. That little copper penny completely bypassed the crucial safety mechanism of the fuse box. It guaranteed that the power would stay on while simultaneously turning the delicate, aging cloth wiring inside the living room walls into a highly combustible ticking time bomb. Nobody thought twice about the catastrophic fire hazard. It was just how you kept the television running. And when it came to cleaning up after a heavy weekend car repair project, there was no gentle organic pumice hand soap with aloe vera. If your father had thick black grease, heavy motor oil, or stubborn oil-based paint completely covering his hands and forearms, he would just walk out to the driveway, take the metal cap off a heavy red fuel canister, and vigorously wash his bare hands in pure, highly toxic, leaded gasoline. He would splash the volatile liquid onto his palms, scrub the toxic fuel right into his skin to dissolve the heavy grease, wipe his hands clean on a filthy shop rag, and then casually light up a cigarette without a single second thought. The sheer flammability of the average suburban garage on a sunny Saturday afternoon is an absolute miracle in itself. And if you think the adults were actively living on the edge, the way we transported and contained fragile infants back then was absolutely mind-boggling. We already talked about older kids happily bouncing around the cavernous back of the station wagon, but what about the newborn babies? Today, infant car seats are incredibly complex. Rear-facing structural pods engineered with aerospace-grade impact foam, 5-point safety harnesses, and strict expiration dates printed on the plastic. But in the 1950s and 60s, a baby car seat was nothing more than a flimsy, hollow metal frame loosely covered in a thin layer of colorful vinyl. And the primary safety mechanism? It didn't strap into the heavy lap belts or anchor to the heavy steel floorboards. Instead, the entire fragile contraption just had two thin metal hooks coated in plastic that casually draped right over the back of the front bench seat. That was it. If the driver slammed on the heavy manual brakes to avoid a stray dog, the baby, the flimsy seat, and the hooks would completely detach and go flying forward toward the steel dashboard as a single, terrifying unit. Inside the house, there were also those terrifying, completely unrestrained baby walkers. Parents would place a tiny, wobbly infant inside a collapsible metal frame, resting on small, frictionless rolling casters, basically giving a 6-month-old child a set of fast wheels and unlimited, unsupervised mobility across the slick linoleum floor. We would violently crash into the hard plaster walls, eagerly roll over exposed electrical extension cords, and, in many horrifying, unspoken cases, launch ourselves directly down a full, uncarpeted flight of steep wooden stairs. When it was finally time for a nap, babies were placed in painted drop-side cribs with wooden slats set so incredibly wide apart that a growing child could easily get their entire head stuck firmly between the rails. To keep us quiet, mothers would simply prop a heavy glass bottle of warm milk on a rolled-up blanket, letting the baby feed completely alone in the dark, a severe choking hazard that modern pediatricians actively warn against on day one. But perhaps the most drastic, unbelievable shift between then and now is what we were actually putting into our growing bodies. The 1950s ushered in the absolute golden age of highly processed, space-age convenience foods, and we consumed them with absolute, unquestioning enthusiasm. Today, parents carefully read every single nutrition label, strictly monitor daily sugar intake, and are hyper-aware of a million different severe food allergies. But back then, sugar wasn't considered a dangerous, addictive additive. It was actively and heavily marketed by corporations as essential, quick energy for active, growing kids. If a child was complaining about being hungry between meals, it was perfectly normal for a mother to take a slice of soft, heavily processed white bread, slather it edge to edge with a thick layer of yellow butter, and pour a massive mountain of pure white granulated sugar directly on top. That was a completely acceptable, widely endorsed afternoon snack. And dinner time was often a bizarre, terrifying culinary experiment. It was the undeniable era of the savory Jell-O mold. Housewives, influenced by glossy magazine advertisements, would confidently suspend entirely unrelated savory foods, like chopped chunks of boiled hot dogs, flaked canned tuna, green stuffed olives, hard-boiled eggs, and shredded carrots, inside a massive, wobbly, towering ring of bright green lime or lemon gelatin. It was placed on a bed of wilted iceberg lettuce and considered a highly sophisticated modern centerpiece for a neighborhood dinner party. We ate every single bite without complaining. When mothers didn't feel like cooking an elaborate gelatin masterpiece, they enthusiastically turned to the ultimate modern marvel of the space age, the frozen TV dinner. This wasn't the safe, microwavable, cool-to-the-touch plastic tray of today. This was a completely rigid, heavy aluminum tray, tightly sealed with a thick layer of crimped foil. It featured perfectly divided, stamped metal compartments for a slice of heavily processed mystery Salisbury steak, a dollop of mashed potatoes made entirely from dehydrated boxed flakes, and a scoop of bright green peas swimming in a pool of salty yellow butter. You would place the entire aluminum tray directly into a roaring hot oven and let it bake for nearly an hour. When it finally came out, the metal was scorching, blisteringly hot. You would sit cross-legged on the rough living room carpet, carefully balancing this incredibly hot, sharp-edged aluminum tray directly on your bare knees, trying desperately not to suffer third-degree burns while watching a black-and-white western on the heavy wooden television set. There were absolutely no warnings or concerns about aluminum chemicals leaching into the boiling hot food or the massive blood pressure spiking sodium content hidden inside the gravy. We simply peeled back the boiling hot foil, completely burned our tongues on the bubbling cherry cobbler dessert compartment, and considered ourselves incredibly lucky to be living in the futuristic, modern age of push-button convenience. And finally, all that unchecked granulated sugar, highly processed food, and questionable mid-century nutrition eventually led to a mandatory trip to the local dentist, which was an entirely different kind of brutal endurance test. Modern dentistry is entirely focused on gentle pain management, using topical numbing gels, high-speed whisper-quiet drills, and invisible tooth-colored composite resins. But a mid-century dentist office was a place of genuine, unavoidable childhood terror. The drills weren't fast and quiet. They were low-speed, belt-driven mechanical monstrosities that aggressively vibrated through your jaw and rattled your entire skull. The high-pitched, slow grinding noise echoing in that tiny room was deafening. If you had a deep cavity, there was rarely any Novocaine or laughing gas involved for a tough kid. The dentist, usually smoking a cigarette just like the family doctor, would simply tell you to tightly grip the heavy metal armrests of the chair and be brave, while he slowly and painfully drilled deep down into the sensitive nerve of the tooth. And what did they use to fill that gaping hole? Heavy amalgam fillings. The dentist would literally mix raw, highly toxic liquid mercury with a silver alloy powder right there on a metal tray inches from your head. He would mash the toxic slurry together before forcefully packing that heavy metal directly into your open mouth. Those dark, highly visible silver fillings constantly expanded and contracted with hot coffee and cold ice cream, eventually cracking the surrounding tooth structure over the years. We walked out of that terrifying office completely traumatized, our mouths permanently full of toxic heavy metals, only to be immediately rewarded by our parents with a massive sugary ice cream milkshake for being such a tough, brave kid. It was a perfect, unending cycle of beautiful, dangerous mid-century logic. After recovering from the trauma of the dentist chair, you eventually had to go back outside and face the changing seasons, which brought entirely new categories of incredibly dangerous, unsupervised entertainment. Let's talk about surviving the winter. Today, when the snow falls, children are bundled up in high-tech, waterproof, insulated Gore-Tex suits, strapped into brightly colored foam sleds, and sometimes even equipped with winter sports helmets before heading to a gently sloped neighborhood hill. But in the 1950s and 60s, winter recreation was a brutal, high-speed test of courage. Our weapon of choice was the iconic, flexible flyer. This wasn't a soft, forgiving piece of plastic. It was a heavy, rigid platform made of solid wood planks bolted securely to a pair of sharp, heavy iron runners. To make it go faster, we would actively rub candle wax or paraffin all over those metal blades. We would hike up the steepest, most terrifying incline in town, a place usually affectionately referred to by the local kids as Suicide Hill, take a running start, and throw ourselves face first onto the wooden deck. You were flying head first down an icy mountain, your nose mere inches from the freezing ground, steering a heavy metal projectile with absolutely no braking mechanism whatsoever. If a massive oak tree or a parked car suddenly appeared in your path, your only option was to violently roll off the sled at high speed into the hard-packed snow and hope for the best. But the sledding hill wasn't even the most dangerous winter activity. That honor belonged to a terrifying suburban tradition known as skitching, or ski hitching. When the local roads iced over and the snowplows hadn't yet arrived, adventurous teenagers and foolish younger kids would quietly wait at stop signs. When a heavy city bus, a delivery truck, or a family station wagon slowly pulled away from the intersection, we would run up from behind, crouch down low on the slippery asphalt, and tightly grab the heavy chrome rear bumper with our bare, freezing hands. The vehicle would accelerate, dragging us along the icy public roads behind it. We were essentially water skiing on raw asphalt and black ice, inches away from massive spinning tires and heavy exhaust pipes. If you hit a dry patch of pavement or a hidden pothole, your winter boots would instantly stop, the bumper would violently rip out of your frozen grip, and you would be sent tumbling wildly across the road into the path of whatever vehicle was driving directly behind you. It was an astonishingly common practice, and we did it purely for the adrenaline rush. When the ice finally melted and the sweltering heat of summer arrived, the danger simply relocated to the local public swimming pool. Modern public pools are heavily regulated aquatic centers with soft, sloping zero-entry edges, slip-resistant decking, strict capacity limits, and an army of highly trained lifeguards constantly blowing whistles at the slightest hint of running. But the mid-century public pool was essentially a massive, unforgiving concrete basin filled with heavily chlorinated water that burned your eyes until they were completely bloodshot. The edges of the pool were made of rough, scraping concrete that would instantly tear the skin off your knees and elbows if you tried to climb out the side. And then there were the diving boards. We didn't just have the low, bouncy springboards, we had the high dives. These were towering, rickety metal structures with steep, slippery ladders that led up to a rough fiberglass plank suspended terrifyingly high over the deep end. You would stand up there, shivering in the wind, looking down at the hard water, while a line of impatient kids on the ladder yelled at you to jump. Meanwhile, at the bottom of the deep end, kids were playing a highly dangerous game to see who could hold their breath underwater the longest, sitting cross-legged on the concrete floor until their lungs burned and their vision blurred, while the single teenage lifeguard on duty was completely distracted, listening to a transistor radio and drinking a glass bottle of Coca-Cola. We also swam in unregulated rock quarries, murky local creeks, and muddy lakes, eagerly diving headfirst off rope swings into dark water without ever checking to see if there were submerged rocks or heavy tree branches hidden just beneath the surface. But the absolute peak of summer danger wasn't the swimming pool. It was the highly anticipated arrival of the traveling carnival. Today, amusement park rides are multi-million-dollar feats of structural engineering, subject to daily computer diagnostics, rigorous safety inspections, and complex over-the-shoulder hydraulic restraints. In the 1960s, a traveling carnival was a chaotic collection of heavy, rusted metal machinery that had been hastily assembled overnight in an empty dirt parking lot by a crew of exhausted men smoking cigars. We eagerly handed over our tickets to strap ourselves into these terrifying contraptions. The safety features were almost laughably non-existent. If you got on the tilt-a-whirl or the scrambler, the only thing keeping you from being violently ejected into the night sky was a single, thin, padded metal lap bar that loosely clanked into place and left about 6 inches of empty space above your legs. You would be slammed aggressively against the hard metal sides of the cart, crushing your siblings, as the ride operator manually cranked the engine faster and faster. The most legendary ride was the rotor, a giant spinning wooden barrel. You stood against the wall, the entire machine spun at a dizzying, nauseating speed, and then the wooden floor simply dropped out from beneath your feet. You were pinned to the rough wall entirely by raw centrifugal force, suspended in midair, while people above you looked down and dropped pennies. We walked away from these carnivals with severe motion sickness, mysterious grease stains on our clothes, and massive bruises on our ribs from the lap bars, completely thrilled and counting down the days until the fair came back to town. When we finally returned home to relax, even the simple act of trying to watch television could turn into a life-threatening stunt. Before cable television and fiber optics, the only way to get a clear picture on the heavy wooden cabinet television set was through a massive, jagged aluminum antenna strapped to the chimney. Whenever a strong thunderstorm rolled through the neighborhood, the wind would inevitably knock the antenna out of alignment, turning the evening broadcast into a screen of loud, buzzing static. Nobody waited for the storm to pass. Your father would simply grab a heavy metal ladder, carry it out into the torrential rain and the flashing lightning, and climb directly up onto the steep, slippery, slanted roof of the 2-story house. He would stand up there in the pouring rain, holding onto a giant metal lightning rod, manually twisting the jagged aluminum frame left and right. Meanwhile, someone had to stand outside on the wet grass, yelling up to the roof, acting as a human relay for the people inside the living room, who were loudly reporting on the quality of the fuzzy black and white picture. Inside the house, the kids were sitting cross-legged on the floor, their faces positioned exactly 2 inches away from the glowing cathode ray tube, completely ignoring our mother's constant, dire warnings that sitting that close to the television would permanently ruin our eyes and radiate our brains. Let's step away from the television for a moment and talk about how we earned our pocket money, because childhood employment in the mid-century was basically an exercise in heavy industrial labor. Today, teenagers might run a social media account or walk a dog for extra cash. But back then, if you wanted a few dollars to take to the candy store, you had to perform hard, physical, and often incredibly dangerous work. Take the classic American paper route. It sounds idyllic now, but the reality was a grueling daily grind. At 4 o'clock in the morning, while it was still pitch black and freezing cold, a massive truck would drop a giant bundle of heavy newspapers directly onto a damp street corner. As a 10-year-old kid, you had to wake yourself up, walk down to the corner, and roll those thick ink-stained papers by hand, securing them with tight rubber bands. You would load them into a massive canvas bag slung over the handlebars of your bicycle, making the bike so incredibly top-heavy that it was almost impossible to steer. Then, you rode through the dark, empty streets, throwing papers onto porches in the dead of winter, slipping on black ice, and outrunning aggressive neighborhood dogs that were roaming free. You were entirely alone in the dark before the sun even came up, and at the end of the week, you had to knock on the doors of complete strangers to collect the subscription money in cash. When we weren't delivering papers, we were trusted with heavy landscaping machinery. If your father wanted the front lawn cut, he didn't hire a professional crew. He pointed you toward the garage. Early power lawnmowers were terrifying machines. They were heavy, cast-iron beasts powered by loud, unregulated gasoline engines. And safety features? They were absolutely non-existent. There was no dead man switch on the handle that automatically killed the engine if you let go. There was no rubber guard at the bottom of the deck to stop flying debris. When you fired up that roaring engine, the massive steel blades spun with terrifying force. If you accidentally hit a rogue pebble, a lost glass marble, or a forgotten metal toy car hidden in the tall grass, that mower instantly transformed into a high-speed shrapnel launcher. It would violently eject the object sideways at the speed of a bullet, shattering neighborhood windows and denting the siding of the house. And the most shocking part by today's safety standards, we routinely pushed these heavy, lethal, roaring machines across the sloping, wet grass while completely barefoot or wearing nothing but flimsy canvas sneakers. And the concept of danger was never more enthusiastically celebrated than on the 4th of July. Today, municipal fireworks displays are carefully orchestrated by licensed professionals using electronic ignition systems, while families sit hundreds of yards away behind safety barricades. The fireworks sold to the public now are heavily regulated, quiet, and mostly just emit colorful sparks. But the fireworks we had in the 1950s and 60s were essentially military-grade explosives sold directly to children from roadside tents. We didn't just have sparklers, we had massive, thick red M80s and authentic cherry bombs. These were waterproof, tightly packed explosives that possessed enough concussive force to completely obliterate a heavy metal galvanized trash can or blow a mailbox clean off its wooden post. We would buy a paper bag full of these explosives and spend the entire afternoon blowing up our plastic army men, destroying our plastic model cars, and launching heavy metal soup cans hundreds of feet into the air. When the sun went down, the real chaos began. The neighborhood kids would divide into teams, light up the fuses of long cardboard Roman candles, and actively shoot blazing high-speed balls of colored fire directly at each other across the street. We dodged flaming projectiles in the dark, laughing hysterically, while our parents sat on lawn chairs drinking beer, completely unbothered by the fact that their children were engaging in a literal firefight in the front yard. Even our daily toys prepared us for this kind of suburban warfare. The ultimate highly coveted birthday present for any young boy was a lever-action BB gun, like the iconic Daisy Red Ryder. It was treated as a rite of passage. We were handed these heavy metal and wood rifles and simply told to go outside and not shoot out the windows. We roamed the nearby woods and empty lots, setting up empty glass Coca-Cola bottles on wooden fences and shattering them into a million tiny, hazardous pieces that would just stay in the dirt forever. The famous warning, "You'll shoot your eye out," wasn't just a funny line from a movie. It was a legitimate daily medical concern because we constantly shot at hard surfaces, and those copper BBs would violently ricochet straight back at our faces. If we didn't have BB guns, we resorted to the cheapest ammunition available, the dirt clod war. We would find a construction site or an empty dirt lot, build makeshift forts out of discarded plywood, and hurl massive rock-hard clumps of dry dirt and stones at each other's heads until someone went home crying with a bleeding scalp. And when we finally went inside to warm up, the house itself was full of hazards waiting to catch us off guard. During the freezing winter months before the era of central heating, families relied heavily on portable electric space heaters to warm up drafty bedrooms. These weren't the cool-touch ceramic, automatically shut-off towers we have today. These were heavy metal bowls with a giant, glowing, red-hot electric coil completely exposed in the center. They radiated an intense, scorching heat. They were routinely placed directly on top of highly flammable shag carpeting or right next to long, flowing window curtains. If a child bumped into it or a dog wagged its tail too close, there was no tip-over switch to shut it down. It would just sit there, glowing cherry red, happily melting the carpet or catching the fabric on fire. We also had those heavy, terrifying electric blankets. The internal wiring was thick and rigid, and if you accidentally folded the blanket the wrong way while sleeping, the internal wires would overheat, creating a massive burning hot spot right on top of you. Between the exposed heating coils, the lead paint, the asbestos, and the roaring burn barrels out back, our mid-century homes were basically an obstacle course of extreme hazards. But we navigated them every single day, completely unaware of the danger, living our lives with a kind of fearless, unsupervised joy that simply doesn't exist anymore. Let's shift gears for a moment and talk about what happened when we got a little older and finally earned the ultimate symbol of American freedom: the driver's license. Today, teenagers have to navigate graduated licensing programs, log hundreds of hours of supervised driving with their parents, and take their road tests in modern vehicles equipped with backup cameras, lane assist, and automatic emergency braking. But back in the 1950s and 60s, getting behind the wheel was a completely different, highly dangerous adventure. At 15 or 16 years old, you were handed the metal keys to a 2-ton steel land yacht. These cars were massive, heavy machines with gigantic V8 engines, and they handled absolutely terribly by today's standards. We didn't have power steering, so turning the massive steering wheel took genuine upper body strength. We certainly didn't have anti-lock brakes. The cars were equipped with standard drum brakes that faded quickly when they got hot. If you had to stop suddenly in the pouring rain, you had to manually pump the brake pedal with your foot and pray the heavy car wouldn't go into a completely uncontrollable, terrifying tailspin. And what did we do with these massive, unsafe steel machines? We drove them as fast as humanly possible. Drag racing between stoplights on the main strip or out on deserted country roads wasn't just something you saw in the movies. It was a standard Friday night activity. We pushed those big engines to the absolute limit without wearing a single seatbelt. But the ultimate teenage driving experience was undoubtedly the local drive-in movie theater. The drive-in was the social center of the universe, but tickets cost money. So to save a few dollars, it was standard practice to stuff 3 or 4 of your best friends directly into the massive cavernous steel trunk of the car before pulling up to the ticket booth. We would lay back there in the pitch black, squished together, breathing in heavy exhaust fumes and the smell of the spare tire, staying completely silent until the driver parked and knocked on the trunk lid to let us out. We willingly locked ourselves in the trunk of a car just to see a double feature of terrible monster movies for free. When we weren't driving, we were walking around the neighborhood with things in our pockets that would trigger a massive police response today. I am talking about the classic Boy Scout pocket knife. Today, a child bringing a folding knife onto school property would result in an immediate lockdown, expulsion, and a news broadcast. But in the mid-century, every single boy had a sharp, bone-handled folding knife sitting right in the pocket of his denim jeans. We brought them to school every single day, and nobody cared. We used them to whittle wooden sticks on the playground, cut rope, and most terrifyingly, to play a popular game called Mumble-T-Peg. You would literally stand facing your best friend on a patch of dirt and take turns throwing a sharp, open pocket knife directly at each other's bare feet. The goal was to get the heavy blade to stick straight up in the dirt as close to your friend's toes as humanly possible without actually drawing blood. It was absolute madness, a game entirely based on the risk of stabbing your friend in the foot, and the teachers on recess duty would just walk right past us and completely ignore it. Then, there was the everyday hazard of our own clothing. Long before the government stepped in and heavily regulated the textile industry, our clothes were essentially highly flammable tinder. Our winter pajamas, nightgowns, and fuzzy bathrobes were often made of untreated cotton or highly combustible synthetic blends. Combine those highly flammable pajamas with the glowing red-hot electric space heaters we talked about earlier, or a mother cooking breakfast over an open, roaring gas stove flame, and it was a recipe for absolute tragedy. And the clothes themselves were stiff, heavy, and incredibly unforgiving. We wore stiff, rigid leather shoes to school that completely lacked any kind of orthopedic support. They would give us massive bleeding blisters on our heels, and our parents would simply tell us that we had to suffer through the pain until the tough leather finally broke in. When summer hit and the heavy clothes came off, we faced the brutal, inescapable reality of surviving a heat wave without central air conditioning. A modern home today is a completely sealed, climate-controlled bubble. Back then, a humid July heat wave meant pure, agonizing survival. Our only real defense mechanism against the stifling heat was the heavy metal box fan sitting in the open living room window. These fans were basically industrial-strength wind machines. The massive metal blades spun at terrifying high speeds, and the protective metal grille on the front had gaps so incredibly wide that a toddler could easily stick their entire hand inside. We would stand right in front of it, leaning our sweaty faces into the loud breeze, purposely speaking directly into the rapidly spinning metal blades to hear our voices chop up and sound like robots. We were always just one slip away from losing the tip of our nose or a finger. At night, when the heat inside the house felt like a heavy brick oven, nobody even bothered trying to sleep in their hot, stuffy upstairs bedrooms. Entire families would abandon their beds and drag heavy mattresses straight down the wooden stairs to the living room floor, hoping to catch a slight cross breeze from the front door. If you had a screened-in porch, you slept out there. And if you lived in a hot, crowded city apartment, It was completely normal to take your blanket and pillow and sleep directly on the cold, rusty metal grates of the exterior fire escape, suspended several stories above the concrete sidewalk. We slept outside in the humid night air, completely exposed to the elements, the loud street noise, and whoever was walking down the alley below, perfectly content to sacrifice our safety just for a few degrees of cooling relief. Let's bring this journey to a close by looking at the bigger picture of what all this incredible everyday danger actually produced. Us. When you look back at everything we've talked about today, the heavy lead paint, the liquid mercury, the total lack of seatbelts, the toxic chemical fog, the blazing backyard burn barrels, and the absolute lack of constant adult supervision, it truly seems like a miracle that any of us made it to adulthood. But the honest truth is, we didn't just survive this harsh environment, we thrived in it. We built an incredible, unbreakable kind of resilience that is almost impossible to replicate in today's carefully padded world. Think about our immune systems. Today, we have automatic hand sanitizer stations at the entrance of every grocery store, and children's play environments are rigorously scrubbed with heavy antibacterial wipes. But our immune systems were forged in the absolute dirt. We played in mud all afternoon, we drank out of shared, rusty garden hoses, and we happily shared bites of unwrapped penny candy that had been sitting in the lint-filled pockets of our dirty denim jeans. If a kid in the neighborhood got the chicken pox, the measles, or the mumps, parents didn't isolate them in a sterilized quarantine. They did the exact opposite. They threw a neighborhood chicken pox party. Mothers would actively send their healthy children over to the sick kid's house to play in the exact same room, share the same toys, and drink out of the same glass cups just to get the infection over with before school started. It was an era of raw, unregulated exposure. We built an absolute fortress of an immune system because we were constantly, unapologetically bombarding it with every single germ the neighborhood had to offer. And that deep resilience extended far beyond our physical health. It was the entire foundation of our character. Because we were left completely alone to navigate this dangerous world, we learned exactly how to solve our own problems. If your bicycle chain popped off while you were 3 miles away from home, you didn't have a mobile phone to call your father to come pick you up. You flipped that heavy Schwinn bicycle upside down on the grass, completely covered your bare hands in thick black mechanical grease, and figured out how to manually thread that oily chain back onto the sharp metal gears yourself. If you got into a bitter, screaming argument with your best friend over a game of baseball in the vacant dirt lot, there were no adults around to intervene, mediate the conflict, or gently validate your feelings. You had to stand there, yell it out, compromise, and figure out how to keep the game moving before the sun went down. We learned complex negotiation, basic mechanical repair, and strict emotional regulation all on our own, out of sheer necessity, because the adult world was completely busy dealing with its own problems. We were a generation of kids who knew exactly how to fail. We climbed to the very top branches of the tallest, most dangerous oak trees in the local woods, fully knowing that if we stepped on a dead, rotting branch and fell, it was going to hurt. And we did fall. We broke arms, we fractured collarbones, we knocked out teeth, and we got stitches. But we didn't blame the tree, and our parents certainly didn't sue the city or the property owner. We learned a very simple, very harsh, permanent lesson about gravity, risk, and personal responsibility. And then, a few weeks later, when the heavy white plaster cast finally came off, we went right back outside and climbed a different tree. We understood early on that physical risk was an inherent part of a life well lived, and that failing or getting hurt wasn't the end of the world. It was simply how you learned to be smarter and tougher the next time. Today, the modern world is undeniably safer, and we all understand exactly why those strict government regulations, heavy safety belts, and bright warning labels were eventually put into place. Nobody actually wants to go back to a time of completely unrestrained car rides or lead-painted baby cribs. We love our children and our grandchildren, and we want to protect them from the harsh, unforgiving edges of the world we grew up in. But in padding all those sharp corners, in removing every single element of physical risk, and in constantly hovering over every single minor decision they make, we have to wonder if something incredibly valuable was permanently lost along the way. We traded our absolute freedom for guaranteed safety, and we traded our fierce independence for constant, anxious supervision. The 1950s and 60s were a chaotic, dangerous, wildly unsupervised time to be a child in America. We drank warm water from rusty brass pipes. We breathed in heavy chemical fog. We rode in massive steel death traps, and we played with actual military-grade explosives on the weekends. It was a completely different universe, running on a completely different set of unforgiving rules. But looking back at the scraped knees, the severe sunburns, the heavy wooden paddles, and the absolute, beautiful freedom of wandering the neighborhood until the streetlights finally came on, I wouldn't trade a single second of it. We learned how to be tough, and we learned how to be completely self-reliant, and most importantly, we learned how to truly live. Thank you so much for joining me today on this incredible trip down memory lane. It has been an absolute pleasure sharing these wild, vanished memories with you. If these stories brought a smile to your face, or if you remember drinking from that exact same green garden hose, please leave a comment below and share this video with someone else who survived the greatest era of childhood. Until next time, stay safe out there, and never forget the simple, tough, beautiful days when we ruled the neighborhood. Goodbye, everyone.